So, to begin, let's look at our text. Bill, would you do us the honor of reading this text for us? Of reading your own text. And turning on your microphone first, I think.
Like that is better.
Yes,
okay.
Perfect.
It won't make me a better accent, but at least you will be able to hear me. So I have to read my own text.
Yes, please.
Okay.
We have it here too, if that's better.
Yeah, that's a bit better. Thanks. Ok. Pour le titre, j'avais pensé à Montagne russe. Comme l'histoire se déroule à Tcheliabinsk et que les personnages vivent un ascenseur émotionnel, ça fait un double sens. Nathalie cherchait le regard perdu de Madame D, qui réfléchissait, mâchonnant son bic 4 couleurs. La Russie, c'est pas ce qui vend le mieux en ce moment. T'as pas une autre idée ? Si, j'ai également Nos sentiments les meilleurs. Là aussi, ça cerne bien le livre, puisqu'il est beaucoup affaire de sentiments, et que c'est un roman épistolaire. Ouais, bof, c'est tiré par les cheveux. Tu sais que, vu ton succès planétaire, cette romance sera traduite jusqu'en Islande et en Corée ? Tu crois que ton double sens va passer en coréen ? J'aimerais qu'on parte sur un truc plus parlant, plus universel. Bon baiser de l'Oural, coup de foudre dans la taïga, quelque chose dans ce goût-là. Vous venez de dire que la Russie, ça n'était pas universel, soupira Nathalie. Moi qui croyais que c'était l'apanage de tout éditeur qui se respecte de trouver les titres. On m'avait même dit que vous aviez des listes de titres tout cuits à disposition. Ah, mais bien sûr, le dossier titre de rechange. Suis-je bête ? Voyons voir. Madame D pivota vers son écran et fit défiler quelques fichiers. Eh bien, en voici un qui est parfait. Des papillons plein l'estomac. Si je peux me permettre, hésita Nathalie, il ne sera pas plus simple à traduire. Pas faux. Laisse-moi réfléchir. Madame D fit demi-tour dans son fauteuil, plissa les yeux un instant, puis de son plus grand air de responsable marketing, elle se leva et brandit le bic 4 couleurs comme si on pouvait jeter des sorts avec. Il fait quoi déjà dans la vie, ton héros ? Rémouleur. Alors là, ma petite Nathalie, c'est très simple. Tu nous changes ça et tu en fais un entomologiste. À chaque fois qu'il est fait mention d'un couteau, paf, pomme C, pomme V, tu mets l'épidoptère à la place. Couteau à désosser, tu mets grand pan du jour. Couteau éminceur, c'est macaon. Et le tour est joué. Voilà, des papillons plein l'estomac qui s'envolent droit vers la Corée. Mais pas de mai. C'est redondant pour une sortie en mai. Tu as 2 mois, c'est plus que large. Voilà.
Bill, you didn't make this easy for the translators.
I tried to make it as hard as I could.
Yeah.
Of course, because I heard I would be translated by someone who translated Montaigne. So I tried to make a masterpiece of philosophy, first of all. And then I also heard I would be translated by someone who already translated one of my books, because Levin Becker is so modest. He translated one of my books without putting his name as a translator. True story. That's how we met, actually, because I had a book about fish that was to be translated in English, and the publisher had a translator who made a translation that was completely wrong. Like, even myself, I am not Shakespeare, as you can hear, but I noticed it was wrong on the first page. Like, I wrote about, for example, sitting on a sofa, which is called a canapé in French, and the people translated it as appetizer, because canapé, and that's one example, but every page was something like that. So I had to find someone brilliant enough to retranslate the book, but modest enough not to put his name. And that's how I met Levin Becker.
I was very pleased to learn that you were not the sort of person who sits on appetizers.
Yeah. Of course, I did not sit on appetizer. I did not watch myself on an ice cream either, and always like that. But there were also some puns that were made on purpose, especially puns about fish, so very fishy stuff. And Daniel managed to translate a lot of them brilliantly, so I thought, I would try to make it harder this time, but let's see.
So if anyone here is wondering how you could possibly lose at translation, you translate canapé as appetizer. I think we should dive straight into the translations. We are not going to start with Daniel, who we now know has translated Bill before, which could have had you eliminated if we'd known that in advance, Daniel. I'm just saying. Yeah, he's not an amateur.
But nobody can prove that I translated Bill. That's the...
We're going to start with Tess's translation. So if we go to the next slide. And Tess, if you'd like to read... In fact, no, Daniel, you're going to read Tess's translation for us.
I would like to also just point out that Bill, when he sent us this text to translate on Friday, mentioned that he encouraged us to stray from the literal meaning of the text, if necessary, in order to keep the effect, which was a very welcome precision. For the title, I was thinking of White Knuckles' Russian Mountains. Since the story is set in Chelyabinsk and the characters are living an emotional roller coaster, there's a double meaning. Natalie tried to catch Madame Day's eye as she mulled over the title, absently chewing her Bic 4-color pen. Russia's not a great selling point at the moment. Any other ideas? Yes, sure. I also thought of Best Regards, which also captures the book well, because it's very much about people's regard for others, and it's an epistolary novel. Yeah, well, I'm not sure. It's a stretch. You know that given your global success, this love story will be translated even in Iceland and Korea. You think your double meaning will work in Korean? I think we should go with something punchier, more universal. Hugs and kisses from the Urals, love at first sight on the taiga, something in that vein? You just said that Russia's not universal, Natalie sighed. And I thought coming up with titles was the prerogative of any self-respecting editor. I was even told you had a list of titles in your back pocket ready to use. Of course, silly me, the alternate titles folder. Let's see. Madame Day swiveled to face her screen and scrolled through several files. Well, there you go. This one's perfect. A stomach full of butterflies. If I may, Natalie said hesitantly, that won't be any easier to translate. You've got a point. Let me think. Madame Day spun her chair 180 degrees, squinted briefly, then with her grandest marketing manager air, she rose and brandished her Bic 4-color like a magic wand. What does your protagonist do again? He's a knife grinder. Well then, my little Natalie, it's a piece of cake. Just make him an entomologist. Every time a knife is mentioned, bam, Command C, Command V. You replace it with a Lepidoptera. For boning knife, you put peacock butterfly. For chef's knife, swallowtail. And you're done. Your stomach full of butterflies will fly straight to Korea. But may I... No, you may not. It's redundant for a pub date in May. You've got 2 months. That's more than enough.
Tess, walk us through your approach here.
Well, I played it safe, probably to my detriment. So I was trying to stick as close to the puns, but capture some of the spirit. And so, because Russian Mountain, of course, for those of you who don't speak French, means roller coaster. That's the play on words that's operative in the opening thing. So I thought maybe a title that evoked the name of a roller coaster, and in the Russian mountains. And I played around with it for a while. White Knuckles on the Russian mountain, Wild Knuckles ride in the Russian mountains, but then figured that this would be more likely to be a title, so just left it, even though it's not quite as.
It's a good title. I would read that novel.
Okay, and then. So then when it came to the next sort of pun was the best regards, or people regards for others. I can't remember right now what Bill had.
Nos sentiments les meilleurs.
Oh yes, our best sentiments. And that was a bit of a, speaking of things being a bit of a stretch, but I wanted to get regard in. Daniel's is much more inventive.
Don't look at Daniel's, look at yours.
It's too late. And then I think, the dialogue is always a problem when you translate, and I tried to make it as, as convincing as if, you really were, the reader really were sitting in an office between these two, make it as colloquial as possible. And then, then you've got the butterflies in the stomach, of course, would have been the direct translation of the term used in Bill's text, but I thought stomach full of butterflies was a bit more evocative and yeah, interesting. And the rest of it was pretty easy to do once you get the once you decide to play it straight. Then I could do the boning knives with the different Lepidoptera, different kinds of butterflies. And then the final one, of course, is May, and they're redundant for a pub date in May. So I did the "But May I," and I thought it was important to echo the "If I may," Natalie said hesitantly. But of course, the question is, who are you translating for? So, you know, if this is more along the lines of what I would do if I were translating it for a publisher or for in a responsible setting. But, you know, yes, there's different degrees of liberty, and perhaps I didn't take quite enough.
I completely disagree with you, Tess. I think you
All
took
right.
the perfect
Don't give
amount
a
of
vote
liberty.
away.
Sorry. What did you find most challenging about this text?
Oh, the beginning. It
Yeah.
was the Russian mountain, the roller coaster thing.
And was there anything that you found to be easier than you expected it to be? Was there a moment where the voice sort of unlocked for you?
Yeah, once you get past once you figure out what you do with the Russian mountain roller coaster, and then I liked the way Bill wrote the dialogue. It was very sort of, as you would hear, casual, with a certain formality from the professional workplace, but I thought that it was, the dialogue itself was very well done. And so that was, when it's well done, it's always easier to translate. There's nothing harder than translating badly written prose or dialogue.
We're very fortunate to have the brilliant Bill. We're going to turn to Daniel in a second, but Tess, I want to talk a bit more about your translation work more broadly. So you're currently Scholar of Note at the library, and you're working on a project where you're considering the question of style in translation, and this is a stylistically flourishing text. Bill did not make it boring for us. Can you tell us a little bit more about how style enters into the sort of game of translation in your work?
Well, style is a very slippery thing because, of course, everyone experiences a style differently. So what I hope to do in this essay, or maybe a chapter of a longer piece, is think about, you know, how do you define style? How do you capture it in words? And then once you do have a good idea of what makes a style distinctive, or what makes style distinctive per se, the next step then is, as a translator, is how you deal with it. So what do you think about in the transition of one distinctive style in a certain language, a certain context, a certain period, to making that accessible or as effective as possible for the reader? How do you recreate your experience of a particular style for a reader in a completely different time, language, setting, historical moment? So that's what I'm thinking about in the office downstairs.
And this, what you're saying about recreating your own experience, the role of the translator as well as being an experiential person, someone who experiences things and brings their own practices of reading and writing and thinking to the text, is so compelling, and it's going to be really interesting when we bring in our surprise third competitor. But for now, we're going to turn it over to Daniel's translation, and then we're going to start comparing them more, and we're going to bring in all of your input on these comparisons as well. So Tess, if you will do us the honors of reading Daniel's translation.
All right. Should I read it badly?
Please, with a funny accent.
For the title, I was thinking the Swiss cheese affair, because the story takes place in Zurich and the plot is full of holes, so it's a double meaning. Natalie tried unsuccessfully to make eye contact with Madame D, who was lost in thought, chewing on her four-color bic. Switzerland's not exactly what our readers consider an exciting setting. Got anything else? Sure. What about Cordially Yours? That suits the book too, because the killer drowns his victims in a bathtub filled with Poire Williams. It's also an epistolary novel. Yeah, I don't know. It's a bit of a stretch. You do realize that, given your global success, this thriller of yours is going to be translated everywhere from Iceland to Korea? How do you think your double meaning will go over in Korean? I'd rather we went with something more self-evident, more universal. Fondue with a side of murder? A stranger in the Alps? Something along those lines? You just said Switzerland was too neutral, Natalie sighed, and here I thought it was the preserve of any self-respecting editor to come up with titles. I even heard you had a list of ready-made titles for the taking. Of course, the spare titles folder. Where is my head today? Let's see. Madame Day turned to her computer and scrolled through a series of files. Well, here's one that's just perfect. A wolf in sheep's clothing. If I may, Nathalie said hesitantly, that won't be much easier to translate. Fair enough, let me think. Madame Day swiveled back around in her chair, squinted for a moment, and then, with the aplomb of veteran marking director, stood up and brandished her four-color bic as though you could cast spells with it. What does your protagonist do for a living? Cheesemonger. Well then, Nathalie dear, nothing could be simpler. Here's what you're going to do. You're going to make him a sheep farmer instead. Every time cheese is mentioned, bam, Control-C, Control-V, you'll replace it with wool. For camembert, you'll swap in cashmere, merino for pecorino, and there you go. A wolf in sheep's clothing trots off to Korea. But no buts. Keep the steamy stuff above the waist. We're a respectable publishing house. Very nice.
We were talking before, and you said you were sort of hesitating about whether to play it straight or go rogue. And I said I thought I went like half rogue, and now I'm realizing that I went full rogue. No regrets.
Walk us through your decision to go full rogue on this.
Well, certainly emboldened by Bill's permission, so it's all his fault. I, like Tess, started with this puzzle, this sort of insoluble, like Montagne Russe means roller coaster, and you can't get, I couldn't think of a way to get Russia in there in English. And so pretty immediately, and I think you make a great point about the audience, and that if I were doing this for a book that was going to be published, my approach would have been very different. But yeah, exactly. I immediately started thinking, all right, what other nationality? I started thinking about how I could transpose everything. And Swiss cheese was one of the first things that came to mind. It's, I looked at a list of all the countries in the world and just sort of looked at thought which nationalities have expressions that come to mind that were not food. And Swiss cheese is obviously an exception, but it's sort of a little more justifiable. And I considered a lot of other very dishonorable things. I thought of Check Please, which would take place in Prague, and the two protagonists would be trial lawyers. But so my thinking was, once I nailed down this first title translation, everything would have to flow from that. And so if it was going to be Swiss cheese, that meant the justification would be that the plot would be full of holes. And if the plot was going to be full of holes, that meant that it probably shouldn't be a romance, it should be a thriller. And so there's just sort of set of cascading knock-on effects that I for sure overthought, but kind of eventually came to what felt like a relatively okay equilibrium in terms of like making the protagonist a cheesemonger felt like it sort of justified some other departures that I made, because in Bill's text, well, actually, I don't know if the knife sharpener brings out anything in the Montagne Russe, or if it's just a profession that sounds funny. But I thought making it a cheesemonger, adding another layer of justification to the Swiss cheese affair, would sort of strengthen my case. But
It's interesting that you took that sort of interpretive liberty there and made a connection that was not immediately visible in the original text, or perhaps only latent to it.
yeah, I mean, of the many liberties I took.
Yes.
And it's funny, but may I never occurred to me. I was just like, there's no way I can get may in there, so I'm just going to go off in a completely different direction and just end the whole thing with a joke that I thought was kind of a similar in spirit, making fun of the way that this editor is sort of peremptory and, demanding, and but I think I was back to your point about fidelity, it was just very ready to lose the kind of surface fidelity.
And I like what you said about it being true to the spirit of the text. When you embark on a translation project, how do you locate that spirit? How do you know when you found it and when you've been able to replicate it successfully?
It's a good question that I'm not going to have a satisfying
That I
answer
put you
to.
on the spot
I mean,
for.
it really depends on the text, and I do I do work on translations of a lot of texts by writers who really love wordplay. And so I think that goes in hand with a certain kind of libertinism that I have as a translator, where translating it really faithfully, kind of sticking really close to what the original text says, is not as interesting to me as trying to solve these impossible problems. But I don't know, I mean, I think what you said before about the translator being a perceptive entity who has his or her own experience of the text is really important. You know, like, I'm not a perfect reader and I'm not perfectly bilingual, but when I read something in French, I have a sort of a constellation of effects that it has on me, and a big part of the preparatory work is trying to pin down what those effects are, what it feels like to read it, what it resonates with other things that I've read, what voices, you know, sometimes, like, especially if I don't know the author personally, I try to imagine, like, who's reading the audiobook in my head. And that will usually give me some clues about the register that the translation is going to be written in.
Tess, is it a similar experience for you, tapping into the voice, the register, the spirit?
Yeah, you mentioned the Montaigne essays that I translated. I didn't do very many, just about 4 or 5. And there are very good translations of the Montaigne essays. And one reason that publishers commission new translations is purely financial. It's cheaper to pay a translator to do a new version than to buy the rights to existing translations. But it was a joy to do. So what I had in mind, if you read the translations by Frame or some of the very authoritative earlier ones, there's nothing to complain about, but they stick rather closely to syntax, and they respect sentence length. And I thought, and there's a certain stiffness to them that I assume Montaigne's contemporary readers did not feel. So I wanted to, in my mind, hopefully it succeeded, create the ease of access and the fluidity of reading these essays that Montaigne's contemporaries or near contemporaries would have felt. So I was listening to his voice and watching the play of his mind through his sentences and prioritizing that over, say, the structure of the sentences or the way information was delivered, the ordering of it's different, of course, because French and English word order is you can't map it, but similarly. But that's the sense that I mean about trying to capture a style and then recreate it.
I want to open this up to our audience before we switch to our third competitor. But before we do that, I want to turn to you once more, Bill, and just ask for your impressions as you read these two texts. Were you surprised to see your work translated in this way? Did it meet your expectations or diverge from it in interesting ways?
Well, I think the English versions of my text are way better than the French one. So, yeah, that's great. I'm really happy with it, yeah. It really adds, it feels like, to me at least, it feels like it adds more life. Maybe the style is better in English, since you thought about it a lot and refined it. I think Daniel is a bit less faithful to my text because he turned the Macintosh computer into a PC command. So that's a big betrayal that cannot be forgiven.
That was
But
an
apart from
involuntary
that,
slippage, yeah. I surrender now.
apart from that, I'm amazed. No, I'm really amazed because it's two very different ways of translating it, of course, and both of them are, in fact, very faithful to what I meant in two relatively different ways. Because Daniel chose to really try to catch the spirit of it and not to bother with the particular details. And if it was in a published book, I think it would work if the details are just details. Like if this Russian book I mentioned is not part of the plot and is just in this part of the book, it will work very well. If it's part of the whole plot, then it can be a bit trickier. But I don't agree with the fact that it would not work in a published book. I think it just depends on the role of this part in the whole book. I think both of them would really work well in a published book, actually. I love the way White Knuckles Russian Mountains sounds like an English book title. Because I tried to make titles that are kind of caricature of French book titles. Like very short and a bit snobbish in the way it's written. And White Knuckle Russian Mountain, I can almost see the bright pink cover of an English book. So you translated the white snobbish Gallimard cover into a bright pink cover of an airport English book. So I love that. I don't know if I have many more to say. I really loved all the work on my text. It's really fun to hear for when you wrote it in French and you discover it's better in English. It's really fun. Congratulations.
And I want to stress how brilliant both of these translations are. And as we said at the beginning, this was not made easy for you. So I want now to open this up to our audience. This is the moment for you to share observations you've made about the differences between these two texts. It's, as we can all see, it's two vastly different styles, two different approaches to translation with two very different effects. And as we were preparing for the slam, I was speaking to the lovely Tess about it, and she's done these before, and she stressed how wonderful it is for this to be really participative. So if you have suggestions for alternative translations as well, as if you see a word and you think, no, that's wrong, and here's why it's wrong, and I have a different word, don't hesitate to share that as well. If you have questions for the translators about choices they made rather than other choices, this is your moment as well to share those. So for the translators in the audience who want to step on stage and take their shot, or just for the curious listener, this is your moment, so raise your hand, and I will give my microphone to Alfonso, and he will bring it to you.
Not a translator, but what about like Russian over mountains? Like, did you think about Russian as like rushing at all? But it doesn't work for what Bill was saying, that I don't think there would be a novel called Rushing Over Mountains. So, just that.
I confess that did not occur to me.
We should be keeping track of these suggestions. Other questions, comments?
I had actually a question about the way you proceeded. I was struck because I do translate, and I thought it was very interesting that both of you sort of, the titles was what posed the challenge to start, which is very different to me. That's something that deliberately I leave to the end. So I thought, is that how you always proceed with your translations, or was it something that was particular to this short text? Just out of curiosity.
When I'm faced with situations like that, I'll do 3 or 4 different possibilities with slash marks in between, and then I'll go back and I'll refine it depending on, so that it won't hold me up, so that I don't spend an hour thinking about it and then get discouraged and go do something else. So it was, that was in with the slash marks, and then of course the stomach full of butterflies, but also for some reason I couldn't think of plus grand air de marketing manager. So the grandest air, and I thought, no, it just doesn't sound right.
That was really hard.
Yeah.
I struggled with that one.
And I had a problem also with the apanage, because it doesn't, I ended up going with prerogative of, and Daniel said it was the preserve, because it's sort of a metaphorical use of the word and there wasn't a direct conceptual match for that. So that took me forever. So there were a lot of slash marks for a while.
That's funny. Those were the two stickiest, like, non-pun parts for me too. Yeah, like I proceeded in pretty much the same way. Like I don't translate in a way where until I figure out the first pun, I don't look at the rest of the text. Like I read the whole thing, and as I went, I was like, okay, this could be this, or it could be that, or it could be this other thing. But when I say I overthought it, I think part of what I mean is that I was trying to perceive the sort of mathematical structural integrity of the text, which is to say, Russian Mountains gives you the fact that Russia is not what the readers are interested in. It has these consequences for other parts of the text, and even if I went too far into trying to say, okay, well, if I do this, then like the knock-on effect here is going to be different from what it is in French. Like, I probably went too far into that, but I think just the sense of contingency of that, like one thing is gonna, none of this wordplay happens in isolation. That felt really important to respect, or respect when big finger quotes.
To keep consistent.
To keep consistent, yeah,
Internally
thank you.
consistent.
Yeah.
Yeah, and you even made it more consistent with the sonority of the cheese, like camembert, cashmere, and
Couldn't resist.
merino, pecorino. I love that.
Thank you. So I'm just curious, so obviously what we've got here is a dialogue-heavy passage. And I'm wondering if you could speak to the difference between like how you're approaching translating dialogue versus like quoted speech versus, I don't know, long passages of like flowery prose. Because, you know, I'm curious to get a sneak peek of that side of things.
Reading out loud is the biggest help. So I make sure that I tend to read a lot of my translation out loud before, because that's where you hear the mistakes. But it's especially clear when you do dialogue. But it's tricky because it depends on whether you're writing for an British publisher or an American publisher. You know, some publishers are happy with something sort of mid-Atlantic. But I can't do British, so I generally will do my best and then have someone clean it up, the editor, or make it Britishize it. So it's all ear. You know, it's funny how our translations overlap in certain places. Like that's a stretch, and others where it's pretty close match. So yeah. So you know. It's just, thinking about if you were, say, watching a movie, or if you were in a book agent or marketing manager's audience, what do you think what would they be saying, word by word?
Yeah, I mean, Bill did something kind of considerate with this text, which is to say that like it's not all puns, and there's this sort of alternation of there's like a pun and then there's a relatively straightforward piece of dialogue or narration. And so you don't sort of exhaust yourself. You don't like front load the text with the calorie heavy, sugary wordplay, nor are there any stretches that are like prosaic. I absolutely agree with Tess that the ear kind of is everything. And I realize it's a great question, because I realize that I think we both had to read into the power dynamic between these two characters. Like, I don't know that I was consciously imagining that the editor is older and certainly in a position of power, certainly like gets to tutoie the author, and is clearly like has final say over what happens. So Natalie is not happy to be having this conversation, but has to be deferential in some ways. And Yeah, I think just sort of going with that first instinct of like the sort of defeated but patient author talking with the somewhat gregarious but like not actually that attentive, not actually that empathetic steamroller of an editor supplied a lot of the rhythm of how they talk, I think. I was not particularly conscious of geography, to your point. Of just, I think they sort of both speak in a omni-English that I'm sure it's actually not an omni-English, but I didn't bother to break it down more specifically than that.
It's compelling that you both had such clear visions of the characters who were speaking. Is it always sort of visually representative like that, or orally? Do you always know exactly who's talking, know what they look like, know who they are?
Well, it certainly helps if you have a clear idea, maybe not of what they look like, but of what they would sound like, or what register they would speak at, speak in, what level of education or class or, affect. So.
Yeah, I'm not a very visual thinker. So I've tried, like, The Birthday Party, the Mauvignier novel that you mentioned when you were introducing me, like, it's super character driven. There are only, 7 or 8 characters, and you know a ton about all of them. And most of them I don't have a static picture in my head of what they look like. Like, I can hear them talk, and I sort of know how they would behave, but like there's no dream casting in the movie version in my head. It's very, very blurry.
And this is actually a good moment to talk about the Mauvignier novel as well. So Daniel spoke about this brilliant translation in the fall. If you're not present for that, you wouldn't know that Daniel also kept a translation diary that went, if I may use a kind of gross word, quite viral within the literary world, within limits, as viral as a translation diary can be. And you spoke about your process with this very long book, which has very, very dense paragraphs, very, very long sentences, and you had several passes of translation with that book. Could you just walk us through those stages of translation that you went through and tell us if that's different from your usual approach?
It's pretty much always my approach, and the way I break it down in the translation diary very schematically is step 1 is, pass 1 is translating, pass 2 is writing, pass 3 is reading. So the first pass, just take the whole text, get it into English. Like all of the words go from being in French to being in English. Don't trouble myself too much with eloquence. Like, hope that they're the right words, but understand that a lot of them are not going to be the right words. Second pass, now that it's all in English, it's being a little more of an editor, but it's really thinking like a writer, trying to get into the head of the writer and saying, what was he trying to accomplish here? And really tightening everything at the sentence level or the paragraph level with much more attentiveness to the effect that things are having, like much fewer what I keep calling knock-on effects in a book like that, because there's almost no wordplay in that novel. But just sort of like really looking for the right word, the word that the sentence wants, and like,
The cheesemongering of it all.
The cheesemongering of it all. And then the third pass, which is the shortest, is just reading it through as a reader, like insofar as I will ever be able to read that book again without remembering all of the hours that I spent poring over every sentence, but just reading it relatively casually and seeing where do I get snagged, where do I get bogged down, and trying to either unsnag those places or make sure that the places where I do get snagged are faithful to the way that I got snagged as a reader. That book, to your earlier point, had a 4th step, which was it was published simultaneously in the UK and in the US, or like a week apart. And I translated it into US English because that's my native language. And then the British publisher did like a whole separate layer of work to Britishize it. So, it was adding the letter U to color and neighborhood and changing parking lots to car parks. And also a lot of the profanity changed. So that was like some of the most fun exchanges around that book was the publisher being like, yeah, motherfucker doesn't sound right to me here. Like maybe it's arsehole, maybe it's fuckface, maybe it's bellend. And, so that was was a cherry on top of the
Our
process.
next translation slam, we will have perhaps slightly more colorful language as well. Bill, start thinking now. Tess, do you have passes in your translation? Do you go through steps 1, 2, 3? Or?
I actually have a pretty polished first draft, so I do 3 or 4 passes, but I do try to solve as many of the problems I can in the first go through, so that it won't be too painful on the second one. Do you want your pain up front or over the long haul?
It's so funny because for me, the first pass is painful, and the promise is that the second pass will be less painful, and the second pass is always more painful. And I'm just like, I lied to myself, and I knew I was doing it, and I'm still upset.
Before we turn to our third competitor, do we have any further remarks about this translation? Yes.
I have a question that I hope it's not too ridiculous, but when you translate long texts, do you read first the text and on the second reading you'd start translating, or do you go ahead to translating immediately in your first?
That's a very contentious question.
Yeah, it's
There's
not a
strong
ridiculous question
feelings
at all.
on both sides. I just don't have time. For some of the big door stoppers, I don't have time to read the whole thing. And I don't worry about it. I know that what I'm translating in my first version will change, because there'll be, words or phrases will repeat, or there'll be coloring, and, you'll know why something very mysterious in the early part means once you get to the end. But ideally, yes, but it never works out that way. Not in my life.
In practice, I almost always do read the text first, if it's a book, and sometimes it's, if it's an author I don't know, I want to make sure, like the Mauvigné, didn't know his work very well, and it's a 640-page book in French, and I didn't read it very scrupulously, but I read it to be sure that I wanted to translate it, that I wanted to spend that much time on a book that was going to be spooky and a little violent, which is not my jam generally. And so I did give it a read. Most other books, I think I work on commission a lot less than Tess does. A lot of the books that I translate are books that I have read just as a reader and really loved and decided that I want to work on. So I kind of sidestep that question. But with shorter texts that I'm asked to do for more commercial work, I almost always don't read it first. I almost always just start translating, partly knowing that, the second pass is going to be an additional kind of pain that I'll have to go back and correct my misapprehensions from the first time.
But there's some translators who feel very strongly that you shouldn't read it first, because you want to have that element of surprise or uncertainty fresh as you go through the first version. So you can justify anything.
We have a final question from someone who, if I may spoil it, has actually been translated by Tess before as well. So the triangulations of translation continue to spread in the room.
Yes, so I have a probably stupid question for Daniel, because as I'm not an English-speaking person, I didn't understand. You have to explain me this Poir Williams thing. I just don't understand what it has to do with cordially yours.
It's a kind of schnapps.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
a schnapps.
that I know, but I
cordial.
couldn't find any.
A cordial
Casual
is also a schnapps.
It's a schnapps. Okay.
To drink a cordial it's a.
Oh,
yeah.
oh, that's right. Okay. Yeah.
So it's cordially as
Yeah.
in a friendly way, but also a cordial is
Ah. Okay.
very
question.
clever.
So stupid.
Very
No, it was
clever.
great. It was a great question.
No, it's. I don't
That
know.
was another case where I was sort of like listlessly Googling like ways to end a letter, and like what contains something that I can pervert to my own ends, and yeah, like killer drowning victims in a bathtub full of Poir Williams is pretty stretchy. It's pretty tiré par les cheveux. And one of the things that initially fondue with a side of murder was initially I had something like face down in the fondue pot. But I was like, but if they're drowning in a bathtub full of Poor Williams, then I can't say like the fondue pot has nothing to do with it. So
Or you could
more,
have done
more. But yeah, exactly.
Or you could have done kirsch because you've used kirsch in a fondue.
Oh, that's good. Yeah.
Next translation, they'll translate together.
I'll get
Some do.
strong cred to anyone who knows what A Stranger in the Alps is a reference to.
What's the reference to?
It's a reference to two things. So it's the name of an album by Phoebe Bridgers, but that is itself a reference to the movie The Big Lebowski. Has a scene where where John Goodman is furious at this like 14-year-old kid, and he is smashing the windshield of what he thinks is this kid's car, and he's yelling repeatedly, "This is what happens when you fuck a stranger in the ass." And in the television edit of and television like airline edit of the movie, it's "This is what happens when you find a stranger in the Alps." Not making this up, just like.
Yet another example of brilliant translation, translating movies for airplanes. We are now going to introduce our secret third competitor. We'll go to the next slide. So not only do we have Tess Lewis and Levin Becker in person tonight, we had Deep L help us out online. And I'll read for you what Deep L did with Bill's brilliant text. So Deep L has said, "For the title, I thought of Russian mountains. As the story takes place in Chelyabinsk and the characters experience an emotional elevator, it makes double sense. Natalie sought the lost gaze of Mrs. D, who is thinking, chewing on her four-color pen. Russia's not the bestseller right now. Don't you have another idea? Yes, I do. Nos sentiments les meilleurs." Interesting. Note that. Didn't translate it. Again, it's a good description of the book, since it's very much about feelings, and it's an epistolary novel. Moi, mild. It's a bit far-fetched. You know, given your worldwide success, this romance will be translated as far away as Iceland and Korea. Do you think your double entendre will pass muster in Korea? I'd like us to work on something more meaningful, more universal, like Bonne baiser de l'oral, coup de foudre dans la taïga, something along those lines. You just said Russia wasn't universal, sighed Natalie. And I thought it was the prerogative of every self-respecting publisher to find titles. I was even told that you had lists of ready-made titles at your disposal. Ah, but of course, the alternative titles folder. Am I stupid? Let's see. Mrs. D turned to her screen and scrolled through a few lines. Well, here's a perfect one. Butterflies in the stomach. If I may say so, hesitated Natalie, it won't be any easier to translate. Fair enough. Let me think about it. Mrs. D did a half-turn in her chair, squinted her eyes for a moment, then with her greatest air of a marketing executive, she stood up and brandished the four-color bic as if one could cast spells with it. What does your hero do for a living? Remover. Well, Natalie, it's very simple. You change it for us and turn it into an entomologist. Every time a knife is mentioned, pat, pum ci, pum vi, you put lepidoptère instead. A boning knife is a grand pound de jour, a slicing knife is machon, and there you have it. Butterflies in the stomach, flying straight to Korea. But, no buts, redundant for a May release. You've got 2 months, that's more than enough time. What do we think of this translation? Do you buy it? Would you buy it?
I would characterize it as mild.
We obviously do not think that Deep L will take home the box of chocolate tonight, but it gives an interesting opportunity to reflect upon the current moment in translation when softwares or platforms like this are becoming so much more prevalent. If I can make a confession, I use DeepL in my daily professional life when I don't have the time to write an email in French, and it's just so handy and convenient, and it gets 90% of the job done. What's your sort of assessment of the role of AI in translation, and how does it compare with the work that you consider yourselves to be doing as translators?
Well, so I also use it a lot sometimes not by choice. Like I receive a lot of manuscripts in a sort of non-translatorly line of work that I do, cleaning up texts that have been machine translated. And it's really impressive that, like, if you're writing an email where there are no surprises and no wordplay, then DeepL is remarkably good. You still have to read over it, because it will make mistakes. It'll make mistakes that are not glaringly obvious, like translating boeuf as moi, which to me is a kissy noise, not meh. But like it'll very subtly change the gender of a person, or just like it'll move commas around. I think it's interesting here that it. I think Tess, you and I both kept Madame D, and this made it Mrs. D. So like there's sometimes it takes it upon itself to do these things. So like sometimes there are errors, like literal translation mistakes, and then sometimes they're just these unaccountable decisions that it seems to make. And I know I shouldn't ascribe decision making to an algorithm, but this is almost too good a case study to show the shortcomings of something like DeepL, because the comprehension that you need to see what Bill is up to, and not only in terms of style but in terms of wordplay, like that's just, the machine is not there yet. So that's comforting insofar as literary translation usually involves a lot of reading between the lines and figuring out what was going through the author's head, what the effect is, how to reproduce it, etc. But a lot of, translating directions or website copy or instructions for putting together a piece of furniture, like all of that stuff is absolutely fair game for DeepL, and that's people whose job is not literary translation, but sort of more everyday translation. It's a real issue for those jobs.
The real nefarious part of DeepL for literary translators is that now editors will ask you to do post-production editing or post-translation editing. And of course, it takes more time than they admit. Sometimes it takes more time than doing it yourself. And, it's a reason for them to insist on lower pay. So that is a problem. But you get what you pay for, at least in this area now.
Tess, I was speaking to you about DeepL earlier, and you recommended a very interesting article about, I think the title, you can find it's on LitHub, is Why AI Can't Translate Proust. And the sort of thesis of this article is that when an algorithm is translating something, it's just working on the sort of clues that it finds in the text, as opposed to bringing its own kind of situated personal experience to it. And what I've been so struck by tonight is how both of you brought so much of your own personality and character to the text that you translated. That you said you listened to the voices and you could describe their class background, and it's like listening to an audiobook. And so it seems that there is something human missing from the DeepL translation.
If you talk to tech people who work on generative AI, it's pretty scary. It may not be, this faulty forever. The machines may learn how to make those distinctions.
Well, for tonight, at least.
On that scary note.
Yes, on that scary note. It's been such a pleasure to host both of you in this inaugural Translation Slam. Now, I did promise a vote at the end, and I promised a box of hearts to the winner, but one of the first and only objections Daniel had to this panel was that translation really is not a sort of winning and losing game. There is no right translation. There's no translation that's more accurate than the other.
I think we can agree that DeepL is a loser.
DeepL is the loser. No chocolate for DeepL. We do have a box of chocolate hearts, which the two of you will be splitting. You'll have to break it in half. So it represents the broken heart of not winning, but also it's a win for translation in the end. So I don't know where it is, but we will present it to you.